Now let's turn to talking about capital and interest. I will say this is one of my favorite topics. I love capital, I love interest. I think because it's really capital that brings together time in the economic sense, where we have all this machinery, all these investments that have been made in the past, and that ties us to the past, but at the same time, as we invest going forward, we're thinking about the future. So really the past and the present and the future are all tied together when we look at the market for capital. And because time is so important, it ends up that the phenomenon that we know of as interest is also intertied with that phenomenon of capital and investment. So let's turn to look at first then the importance of time in production. We're going to first look at what we call time preference. Time preference is simply the fact that sooner is preferred to later, ceteris paribus. That is, all other things equal, we'd rather have things sooner rather than later. Now, if this weren't true, then we know that we would never consume something, right? It is, after all, virtually always possible to delay our consumption, at least of most goods, into the later future. Yeah, we do actually consume things. This suggests that we would rather have things sooner, and generally speaking, when we delay consumption, it's with some specific reason in mind, right? So, for example, I might believe that, well, I would love to eat something now. I think it would taste even better later on, so I don't think other things are equal when I delay dinner until 6 o'clock at night, say. So, all else equal, sooner is preferred to later. I'd rather have you give me $10 now than at some point in the future, for example. Now, the logical foundation for it, I really like this approach. There are lots of different approaches for proving why time preference must exist. I really like this one, and that it really just comes from the durability of money, or the intertemporal convertibility of money. The intertemporal convertibility of money really just means for me to get $1 tomorrow, if I have $1 now, all I really have to do is wait. Right, so to turn $1 today into $1 tomorrow, I just have to hold it. What that really means is that, strictly speaking, any dollar I have today is strictly more useful than $1 tomorrow. Because $1 tomorrow I can only spend tomorrow. $1 today I could spend tomorrow, or I could spend today, so it's strictly more useful. Right, as a result, I would rather have $1 today than $1 tomorrow. I'd rather have $1 tomorrow than $1 the day after that, and so on. So the sooner I get any particular resource, the sooner I can use it. Or, if I want, I can delay use of it. The fact that it's opening up more options makes a sooner reception of the thing more desirable. That being the case, since I would rather have $1 today to $1 tomorrow, if I'm going to give up $1 today, you better bet I'm going to get more than $1 tomorrow for it. Right? That difference is what we call interest. Right? So I'm only willing to give up $1 today if it's possible for me to get more than $1 tomorrow. That difference, because of time, is what we call interest. And that's exactly the same kind of interest you would earn on, say, a savings account, or that you'd pay on a loan. Now, I will note here that interest rates in the market really reflect time preference and the rate of time preference for market participants. Now, an important caveat is that in the market we live in, central banks actually play a big role in determining interest rates. So here I'm really talking about in a market economy where central banks are not intervening in interest rate markets. In that case, interest rates are going to reflect time preference in the rate of time preference. Where generally speaking, if we have low time preference, that is, I don't have a very strong preference for now, put a very small premium on now, interest rates will be relatively low. You don't really have to promise me a whole lot in the future to get me to give up some money right now. Whereas if time preference is very high, plays a very high premium on right now, in that case, interest rates are going to be very high. I'm only willing to give money up if interest rates are very high. Now, we could also flip these around to the borrowing side and say, well, if I have low time preference, I'm only willing to borrow if interest rates are very, very low. If I have high time preference, I'm willing to borrow if interest rates are still relatively high. This then brings up the idea of time markets. In a time market, present and future goods, including money, would be traded. Right, so I'd be giving something up now to get something later, or vice versa. I'd be getting something now, promising to give something up later. Now, the most obvious time market is the market for loans, right? Where I borrow money to go buy a car, right? So I'm getting that money right now, right? But I'm giving them the promise that I will give it back to them with interest later on. That's the most obvious aspect of the time market, but it's actually not necessarily the largest part of the time market. There's another important part of the time market we'll talk about later on. So in time markets, what ends up happening is they have the buyers of present goods. Those are our borrowers, right? They're the ones that want things right now. They tend to have relatively high time preference, right? That is, for them, it's very important to have things now for whatever reason. Right? Now, as a result of them wanting things now, they end up becoming sellers of future goods, which means because they get something now, they promise to provide something to you in the future, right? So they're promising you future goods in exchange for getting present goods. Right? Or we could think of this in terms of money. They're promising you future money in exchange for getting money right now. Now then we have on the other side the sellers of present goods. Those are our savers. Right? The savers are the ones that are providing goods right now, or providing money right now to the borrowers. Right? These people tend to have relatively low time preference. They're very willing to lend money if they can get anything more in the future. Right? As a result, they end up being buyers of future goods. That is, they are the ones receiving future goods in this exchange. Right? So they're receiving, say, future payment as that money gets paid back to them. So then the interest rate is going to be determined by this balance between buyers and sellers, as in any market. Right? It's really the interaction between the buyers and the sellers of present goods, between the borrowers and savers, that determines what interest rates will be. Right? And this is ultimately then going to be determined by time preference. If we have lots of people that really want to borrow, time preference is relatively high in society. That means there's going to be a huge demand for loans, which will tend to drive interest rates up. Right? But another way, there's a huge demand for present goods relative to future goods. Right? That means that those present goods are going to be considered very, very valuable relative to future goods. Right? So people are going to be willing to pay a lot to get things now, or interest rates will be high. It's just different ways of saying basically the same thing. So now that we've established that time preference is really what gives us interest and interest rates, it's the level of time preference, we can think about what is it that leads to a certain level of time preference. Now, while we know that intertemporal convertibility guarantees that we're going to have positive interest rates, that I'm only going to give up $1 if I can get more than $1 in the future, exactly how willing I am to give up that dollar to get something else, to get some quantity more, and how much more, depends on a number of circumstances. At the individual level, what we might call patience does have a big effect on our time preference. Now, it's not quite the same thing to say that time preference and patience are the same, but they are related. Patience, then, it ends up, is related to a lot of other aspects of our lives, largely tied to this idea of, are we taking a long-term view? Generally speaking, those that develop a habit of taking a very long-term view of things tend to be relatively more patient and tend to have lower time preference. Right? That is, they don't really need things right now. They're perfectly willing to delay their gratification until later. One thing that relates to patience would be something like having children. Now, here I don't mean patience in terms of your ability to withstand irritation. I mean more your willingness to put things off for the future. Now, if you have children, you generally speaking will be more future-oriented, as now you have another generation to worry about beyond your own. Right? As a result, you plan further into the future, you take a longer-term view, you tend to have lower time preference. Religion is something that also can affect the level of patience or how long of a term view we take. All this could go either way. There are some religions that really focus quite a bit on thinking about the very, very long term, say eternity, right? What are the eternal consequences of your action? Here, we're really talking about taking an extremely long-term view, actually as long-term as you can possibly get, right? Forever into the future. Right. Developing that kind of habit will tend to make you have a more long-term view, tend to make you more patient, and therefore tend to give you lower time preference. But there are other religions that focus much more on the reality of the now, not really thinking of the future as anything that really exists. In that case, if you're really focusing on now being the only thing that's real, you place a lot of value on things happening right now. That being the case, we would expect very high time preference if your beliefs push you in that direction. More generally speaking, just culture has an effect on our time preference. Some cultures are very willing to wait, really prize the willingness to wait for things and delay gratification. Other cultures really focus on getting things now and being satisfied in each and every moment as much as you possibly can be. This difference in cultures will then lead to a difference in our time preference. At the individual level, age also has a big impact on time preference. Speaking of just my 16-month-old son, he is, let's just say, not particularly patient. While he's in the middle of chewing one Cheerio, he's convinced that he needs another. He's not very good at waiting for things. At the same time, we would typically expect those that are very old, right, the elderly, also to have very high time preference. They tend not to want to wait for things either, though in their case it's for rather obvious reasons. So it tends to be that on either end of our lifetimes, our time preference tends to be relatively high, while in the middle it tends to be somewhat lower. It's actually not shocking then that when we look at our behavior over our lifetime, it tends to be that when we're very young and when we're very old, we tend not to be saving much. We're either spending out of our savings or we're borrowing. While in the middle of our life, during what you often might call your prime earning years, during that time we also tend to save far more of our income than we would during the other parts of our life. But it also ends up that it's not just, say, patience or these various cultural factors that lead to time preference, but also the political environment in which we live. Do we live under a certain set of institutions or policies that encourage people to take a long-term view or encourage them to take a short-term view? For example, many bureaucracies have what is in effect a use-it-or-lose-it budget policy. This means if you don't use your entire budget one year, you're pretty much first on the chopping block to have it cut in the next year. This naturally will create a very high time preference for anybody that's running any of these departments under this type of policy. After all, you need to use it now or it's not going to be there in the future. And as a result, we see extremely high time preference within these types of bureaucracies. Another policy that can lead to relatively high time preference is having regular elections. It's remarkably difficult to get politicians to think past the next 2, 4, or 6 years, depending on whatever their term happens to be. So that means that it tends to be the case that when policy making happens, it tends to be relatively short-sighted. People are really only concerned about the next election rather than concerned about what's going to be happening with, say, the economy 20 years from now. Right? People are really only concerned with the next time they're up for election, giving them a much shorter-term view than might be the case if, say, they were in office for life.